We're talking about kind of the experience of reading it and how different it was from Ijeoma Oluo's book. And
Yeah.
overwhelmed was a word that's kind of used a couple of different times. What was your experience reading it?
Um, I thought just on the surface that I thought that Ichioma's book was a really easy read, as far as just kind of zipping through it. It was very plain language. And so it was really easy to absorb all the information. And this one felt more like literature in a way where I had to, pay attention to the words. And I just heard the tail end of what you were saying. I read the whole of chapter 1 and then I listened to it because I felt like I was missing a lot. I don't normally listen to books, but listening to it, I actually liked better than reading. Listening to him in his voice, I thought it was more clear. But yeah, I think it's more intense than her book. And I guess where she is kind of more like a teacher and, here are the different things we're covering. This one's like, learn what you will, whatever you absorb from my writing. It's not as much of like a, textbook of sorts, but yeah, very intense and very powerful for sure.
You had mentioned this in one of the questions that it's a letter to his son. What did you think his goal was, or the reason that it was written that way?
I'm not totally sure yet. I keep thinking about it. I think perhaps a little bit it's the same answer that I have of why he uses the word bodies so much, which I think he uses it so much. I mean, it's like you can't not talk about that. But I think that what I was thinking was he's just trying to put so much humanness into it, because the idea that Black bodies, Black people are killed by police and, the police don't get charged for anything. And it's almost like, these African-American people aren't being treated like humans. And so I think him having a son and knowing that he has a son humanizes him and kind of adds like a level of emotion and empathy, which is part of why I think that he talks about bodies so much, which is one, to remind you that we all have a body. And also I was thinking, nobody is ever focusing on the minds of people of other races. It's always just what they look like. And so this idea of, I'm going to lose my body, what I'm going to do with my body. It's like this obsession with just what you look like without really thinking about what's inside. I'm curious to hear what other people thought about the reference to bodies, because that was such a big part of the book.
Yeah, it's a huge part. It looks like we have Danny would like to chime in. So Stephen will be unmuting Danny.
Hi. Actually, my name is Anita.
Hi, Anita.
My husband's computer. Well, I was thinking about the whole idea of body, and what I was thinking is that it kind of the body can represent the whole being. And when he talks about breaking the body, that's breaking the whole being. And by physically breaking, you're breaking the spirit. It all kind of fits together to me when bodies are broken, spirits are broken, and lives are broken, and people are broken. So that's
yeah. Yeah, there were a couple of times where he was really graphic when he was talking about like the injuries and what happens to somebody if they're shot. And yeah, I think kind of what you're saying, it's like a reminder to people of, let's be graphic. Let's really kind of get grossed out by it, because that will make it harder to want to kill someone. If you think of them as a body, as a person, where it's going to be guts and blood and it's gross and it's traumatic, like that's what we should be thinking about, that you're going to break someone's body and how you wouldn't want that done to yourself.
Yeah, or that when we look at statistics and categories and the news reports that someone who is Black is 3.8 times more likely to have a fatal interaction with police, that those are, it's harder to see that in the real terms of what that looks like. He talks about molars and bones in like this very visceral, I think to kind of connect that these aren't just people, like it's a human form, like the injuries are so real and so tangible. I think there's also something to it too. He's an atheist, and the body is there certainly is a spirit and a soul, but he doesn't believe in a sort of another existence. He believes that when your body is broken, that's it. And I think for him, he does see it like there's a finality to that maybe would be missing from someone who has a religious background or believes in sort of an everlasting spirit.
Laura, we'll unmute you so you can speak.
Great. Hello. Yeah, I'd like to go back to the very first two paragraphs, the last sentence of the first paragraph. The first time he mentions body, he says, when the host asked me about my body, her face faded and was replaced by a scroll of words, etc. Then he goes on to the next sentence. The host read these words for the audience, and when she finished, she turned to the subject of my body. And so, to me, treating him as a body takes away his humanness.
Mm-hmm.
It discounts his experiences, his passions, his knowledge, his skills, his, again, humanness. And so it's this, we are treated as this thing, and we're not treated as humans.
Mm-hmm.
She fades, and now we look at his words and we talk about his body.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in the terms of how news is reported, because I was taught as a young reporter that, you know, when someone dies, then you call it the body and you don't call it that when they're alive. And so I was thinking about that when I was reading this too. Like, we don't use that word to describe the people we know or ourselves usually. We don't use the word body. It's kind of like how you describe somebody who's gone. It's just the shell.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is. I hadn't thought of it that way, Laura, but he does, and he's being asked to. Like the host is obviously asking about what it means to be Black in America, or what his perspective is on this, and it's him talking about his body and how that affects, in some ways, how he's able to move through society and move through the world, not because of anything he does, but because of how he's treated and how the world kind of makes sense of him. He talks a couple times too about this breach between me and the world, and the title even being Between the World and Me. There's kind of this, in my mind, the book is very much a look at how the world treats him and how he makes sense of how he's treated, based in large part, what he's come to understand is based on his skin color, how he is seen and how he is defined as Black by the rest of society, by the rest of the country.
Yeah. Did anybody else want to talk about this particular topic before we move on to another one? One part, I didn't put this as a question, but I just marked it in the book. Like you said, I don't usually write in my books either. I wrote in this one. On page 22, halfway down in the second paragraph, this was kind of an epiphany to me when he was talking about the crews, the young men who transmuted their fear into rage were the greatest danger. The crews walked the blocks of their neighborhood loud and rude because it was only through their loud rudeness that they might feel any sense of security and power. They would break your jaw, stomp your face, and shoot you down to feel that power, to revel in the might of their own bodies. Reading about that to me was, I mean, just this idea of, oh, I mean, just people in general, like, that's how a lot of people deal with fear, is to puff up and to have a rage. I mean, we see that with politicians even, but I had never thought about that before, that, you know, this kind of stereotypical group of African-American people, that is where that comes from. And just, I was really struck by him talking about, you know, his dad beating him and saying, you know, I'd rather do it than having the police do it, and how classic it was amongst, or how typical it was amongst his friends that, you know, their parents would hit them kind of out of fear for that for the same, I don't know, that really stood out to me. I don't know if that stood out to anybody else, just what is behind this whole kind of persona that he talks about with the people he grew up with in this book, like what the cause of that is. Danny has another comment. Oh, sorry, Anita.
This isn't exactly great literature, and it's not an very intellectual endeavor, but my husband and I have been watching the HBO show The Wire, which was done in 2002, and it's about Baltimore, which is what he talks about when he's growing up. And it is such an incredible depiction of exactly what he's talking about, and understanding the street life and what you have to do to survive and how much fear there is. And if you don't play the game, everybody's in the game, and the game means you could get killed at any second. It's an amazing picture of all of this that he's talking about.
Yeah. And the fact that that fear could be so deep that actually goes back to slavery, and the fear of, not being free and owning your body results in this kind of fear where it's just a violent lifestyle. I mean, I hadn't thought about that. And, he says, I've never believed the brothers who claim to run, much less own the city. We did not design the streets. We did not fund them. We do not preserve them. I mean, just this idea of like, that he doesn't, they think that they own this area, but that they don't. Like, it's not their land, so to speak.
Well, and the other thing about The Wire that's really relevant for right now, it's a constant battle between the crews and the cops, and it goes back and forth, and you see the brutality and all of the things that we're talking about right now. And it was made in 2002, and it's just still such a relevant picture of what's going on now.
Yeah. Mike Sievers, did you want to make a comment?
Hey, just regarding that fear, I thought it was really interesting when he talked about the different angles it comes from. Like, he was afraid at school and afraid out of school with his friends on the street as well. Like there was no place where he felt safe. Like if he was being beaten at home too, or, abused, and then in danger of being shot on the street by guys that he knew. There's the section where he talks about being in school and sort of the choice between trying to do well in school, like drop out of school and lose your body now, or stay in school and lose your body later, kind of a thing. Like there was just, that's kind of what struck me. There was no safety in any part of his life.
Yeah.
That's something that I don't relate to at all. It's with my privilege.
Yeah. You certainly get the sense, and there's a point there where he talks about all the obstacles that crop up. And the visual that I got was that he's trying to make sense of everything he has to navigate on a daily basis to avoid getting beaten up on the way to school, to avoid getting into a fight. The question of, how do I respond to the teachers to avoid being labeled as someone who's difficult? And he talks about how he didn't really master school, like he wasn't really a good student because he thought that was kind of this rote memorization and he couldn't understand the point. And you get the sense of that it, like, the world has laid out a series of puzzles or obstacles and challenges that he has to successfully navigate. And the consequence is not that, oh, you get a bad grade. The consequence can truly be fatal. And just that nature of it. And I'm glad you read that section, Rachel, about kind of how he saw the neighborhood. Is as he moves on later, he talks about kind of that's not really an accident. It didn't just happen this way. Like, it's the result of conscious policies that have created these sort of socially dislocated neighborhoods where the police there serve a very different function than the police in the suburbs do. That the police, and he remarks about being amazed at the idea that the police would keep you safe, because that's not the function that the police serve in his neighborhood and where he grew up.
Yeah. Cindy's up next.
Hello, yeah. I guess I was caught in this book, and it is beautifully and poetic and lyrical as this book is. I felt I read it before when I read W. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks. When I read, and then you're looking at, that's early 1900s. You get into the 1950s, you read James Baldwin's Native Son, and it's just the same. I mean, it's a different time period, but I keep feeling like, now maybe just me, that I am reading the same in another voice of another generation as we go on, and it just brings me almost to my knees. It's like, in all these readings, it's just boggling. That it just continually the generational trauma that is just passed down from one generation to another. So that when I walked away, it's like I had read it before.
Yeah, no, that is the depressing thing. I mean, there's been no change. I mean, this feels like the first time that people are actually starting to care. I mean, we're all here reading this book. These books are selling out across the country, but you're right. I mean, this book didn't come out 100 years ago, but it came out, I think, 5 years ago, and it sounds like it just came out last week. I mean, it's super depressing.
It's that reality that Cindy just described kind of stands in contrast to one of the stories, and I say we tell ourselves, and that's really not us personally, but collectively, kind of the idea, the dream, as Ta-Nehisi would say it, says that we're a flawed and imperfect country with grand ideals, and we continue to move closer to those ideals, and that the things that we're talking about now are things that we will work to correct, because America is this great experiment. And I think on the other side, and I think this is where Ta-Nehisi probably falls in line and maybe is even less optimistic than James Baldwin was in The Fire Next Time, which is that it's the same system. Like, it's changing. The system itself is changing, but the punishment that is inflicted upon Black people by the machinery, that remains fairly constant. Like, that's not necessarily getting better, as so many people kind of like to reassure themselves to sort of I liked Ta-Nehisi's description of the dream as being this thing that you can wrap your head around and it can comfort you, and that he's never felt any comfort from that.
Yeah, back to what Mike Sievers was saying about how he didn't have a kind of safe place in his life. I felt such a relief when he went away to college. It was like, oh, okay. It just felt, my whole body felt like it relaxed when he was at Howard and, was meeting all of these people from all over. But then, not long after, his friend Prince is killed by this police officer, and it kind of shocks you back, into this reality. You kind of think that he escaped this life, and then you hear or read that this son of 2 doctors who didn't do anything wrong, was killed for no reason by a police officer. And it reminds you, like, nobody is safe. It doesn't matter if you're the son of 2 doctors or if you came from where Ta-Nehisi Coates came from. It just has to do with the color of your skin. We can move on to question 3. Which you just touched on, Danny, the dream. Coates' assessment of our country and its history is harsh and unflinching. He consciously seeks to break down the world around him to the barest form. On page 50, he writes, "The dream is the enemy of all art, courageous thinking, and honest writing." The question is, does he show any signs of optimism or hope in the book? I haven't read the whole book yet. I've only read half, but did anybody get any signs of hope from him?
Nicole says sparingly.
Yeah.
And France gives him hope. That definitely is true. I think one of the spots I see hope is he finds a beauty in the struggle and meaning in the struggle, and he talks about what that is. And I do think that there is a sense of hope there, that you can be true to yourself and and asking questions and seeking to understand sort of the nature of his relationship with the country, and basically kind of encouraging his son to be the same sort of seeker and to not settle for just the surface explanation of it, but really trying to explore and to challenge what he can expect from the world and what he should demand from the world. I found some hope there, that I do think he finds incredible meaning in his life and in his family. But it is sparing. There's not I don't know how hopeful he is for America, and whether he believes that it will sort of remain in this dream state and never really reckon with some of the ugliness upon which it's built.
Yeah, Jeanette just said in the comments, I think he sees hope in his son by telling him about his life. I agree with that, and what you said, Danny. I think the hope is in his family, but I think that he doesn't want people to get too hopeful. I mean, right in that beginning section where he's on the news program, and then what does she say to him at the end? Hold on. Sorry.
That's where they show the scene of is it a police officer that's hugging a young?
Yes, that's it. Exactly. And he says basically like, I haven't done my job, I think is what he says. And that to me was like, oh, that's how the news works. You know, you always want to bring it up at the end, and you don't want to leave on a sour note, but that erases the reality of what's happening. It's like people just want to have a feel-good ending, and that's not what's happening in reality. And so I think I would guess that he doesn't want people to have false hope, because there hasn't been enough work done yet, and there hasn't been enough change yet to feel hopeful. Because I think when people feel too hopeful, that's when you start to rest. And right now we're kind of just at the beginning of this new movement. I think if people get too hopeful and rest, they won't keep pushing hard enough to make changes.
I think it's interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
No,
Rachel.
go ahead.
I think it's interesting that he also finds because he's very critical of himself, of kind of being a bad student, and doesn't graduate from college, and he's not really tough in the neighborhood, but finding journalism, and then kind of he talks about the gift of study at a couple different points. I thought it was interesting how he found a purpose in his work too, and how he talked about that. That was something that made him, and maybe that's where I saw he talks about honest writing, and that the dream is sort of, it prevents honest writing, that he does find a value and sort of a sense of purpose in what he's been able to do. And then the fact that he went from being someone who really couldn't make a living doing it his first couple of years in New York City to, having emerged as someone whose voice is extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess like on the hopefulness around journalism too, you know, he talks about when he got his first paid writing gigs, when he's writing reviews, and he said it was the first time he worked with white people, and they didn't seem, you know, worried about him, or, you know, he didn't feel discrimination. He also didn't feel like they were worried about his life. So that seemed like a little bit hopeful for him there.
Yeah. His journalism career is interesting. He worked at the Washington City paper, which was edited by David Carr. And if anybody knows him, he was the New York Times media critic. He died within the past couple years, but has been a fairly famous or well-respected journalist. And Ta-Nehisi had basically said that David Carr was kind of a tyrant. Like, he screamed and yelled and stuff, which was a funny part of his story.
Anita has a comment again.
Thanks. I wrote down one of the things that he was talking about when he was at Howard, and he said the point of my education was a kind of discomfort. And I think maybe that's part of why he writes, is to create that kind of discomfort so that we keep thinking. But I also want to talk about the first question that you have about race as a child of racism, not the father. And I wrote that down when I was reading the book because it just struck me. And it reminds me of something I've just recently learned about, which I wish and think I should have known how race was created even and why. And it sounds to me like what he's saying is that being named Black was just someone naming them to be the bottom, and that there has to be a bottom in order for there to be the hierarchies, and race was a great way of doing that. And so Black people became the bottom. And that he said something else about racism needs to ascribe bone deep, which means to me unchangeable features to people and their and then humiliate them and destroy them. So you have to create a group to do that, and that's what racism does. And so rather than be against the race, you just find something and put it on them. That's kind of how I took that phrase.
Yeah, that was something that came up in Ijeoma Oluo's book as well. And honestly, I hadn't heard that concept before, and now hearing it again, it just really resonates. And I was thinking about, I read something recently that was saying, we'll hopefully get to this point where gay people won't have to come out anymore. You just will be. It's like some people are gay and some are straight, but you don't have to have this coming out and this anxiety. It'll just be, that's your sexuality. And, I wonder if that's like the eventual, we have so many things to do first, but the striving point is to kind of eliminate the concept of race that was made up for exactly what you just said. Like, we're all the human race, we're just different shades. But just trying to eliminate that concept and not, but right now we're in the point where it's like trying to eliminate the colorblind idea. So I don't know, things will go in stages, but I was just thinking it would be interesting if that disappeared.
But I think if we managed to somehow in a dream world do that, there would be another group of something and someone.
Yeah.
There has to be, it seems like somebody on top and somebody not. So who would it be then? It just feels like it's an ever-ending discouragement.
Yeah, I think, and I agree with you, Anita, but I think there's also something too, and maybe the reason the phrase stuck with me is because I guess there's an understanding of race where we think like, oh, there's a sort of natural division that happens, like you look and someone looks different than you. So we sort and we move people into different groups. And that's really how racism comes about, is just because our brains sort people into different groups. And I think what I heard and read in his line is that the actual fact that we do that according to race instead of whether it was your height or your weight, like the fact that we identify race as such a fundamental characteristic, that's a result of, in many ways, the economic system that was put into place. That's why we fixated on that, because we did need to justify that we were taking an entire group of people and not treating them as people. And so the only way to make us feel that we weren't monsters, or make someone feel that they weren't, is to come up with this sort of racist ideology. I guess for me, it kind of changed. It made sense to me in a way that I hadn't considered before.
Eva asks in the comments, why does there have to be a hierarchy?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to have somebody that really understood anthropology and, just humanness. That's something that I think about a lot and talk about a lot with people, is like how separate we are from humans being animals in our culture. And sometimes it's hard to know why we do the things we do. Is it a part of our culture as, Americans, Europeans, Africans, whatever, or do humans do this hierarchy kind of thing? Like, is that just something we do naturally? I don't know enough about it to know.
Yeah. Is it dictated? Because is it dictated by economics? Like, we have a system that encourages competition.
Yeah.
And probably like that. And that can only reinforce the idea that of making someone into another group that you see as being separate or in competition with you.
Mm-hmm.
But then I know that I've read some people whose sort of social attitudes say, well, it's Darwin and it's based on evolution. And that's too grim for me. I can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't believe that we're all hardwired to be that awful to each other.
Yeah.
How do we want to evolve? Yeah. From Cindy, to sort people into culture doesn't mean we have to rank them, but appreciate. It seems race and caste have is an economic motive.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that that's true.
Do you think that, how would our society change? Do you think our society could exist if there wasn't an American caste system? You know, I mean, because I think about this in regards with just big corporations and, you know, sports teams. It's like, you know, Jeff Bezos is up here and then the people in the warehouse are down here. And I always like, why can't nobody needs that much money? Why can't it be more even? And, you know, sports players make more money than I think that they should. And then the people cleaning the stadium don't make enough to feed their family. Like, would our country collapse or would it just be different? I mean, you know, what do you think would happen if there wasn't the hierarchy and that power? I mean, I lived in Japan for a year, and from what my Japanese coworkers told me, well, there's very low crime in Japan, and that has to do with partly the fact that there isn't that big gap. Like, people make more close to the middle, and they were saying, you know, it's very common for a politician to be friends with a garbage man. Like, there's not as big of the gaps as there are here, and they seem like they're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm curious, you know, how that would work.
Yeah. At the risk of going too far into sort of alternatives, America's a very young country, and in many ways it's remarkable that we're still governed by documents that were written at more than 200 years ago, and that we still believe that those provide the framework. And I would say it's very much an open question of it certainly seems from a lot of indicators that we're moving toward having an increasingly inequitable society as opposed to having a more equal one. And what does that say about the long-term viability of that? Is the framework that we have for our government and really kind of the ethic of the economy, does that leave room? Are we seeing the logical end of that with these pronounced differentiations in wealth and all of the other different social dislocation that goes on? And I think that other question is, how do you change things that were built into it in the beginning? How do you address some of the legacies of institutions that were there to deprive a significant chunk of our country with like basic being viewed as humans, as equals to the rest of us? How do we redress some of that inequality?
Yeah, can you live in a capitalist country and not have these things, you know, not have these class issues based on economy? Like, the whole government, everything is based on economy. So so many people don't want to budge from that. You know, people don't want even socialized medicine. I mean, I think, yeah, this is going, you know, deep, but I mean, I think that's what you have to do though. It's like, these aren't surface problems. I mean, they go so deep. And I think a lot in our country is the individualism that we're seeing with quarantine and COVID, like how strong the individualism is about mask wearing and stuff. Like, people don't really, I'm not saying everyone, but a lot of people don't care about the greater good. It's like, well, I'm doing fine, so I don't care. Like, you know, people shouldn't be on welfare, but I don't really care if they don't have any money. And they don't realize that if the bottom isn't happy, that affects the middle and the top. Like, it's just one big machine, but people don't care unless it's happening to them.
I think, and this kind of comes back to the book, I think one of the things that's very interesting about the approach that he took is that he doesn't sort of suggest alternatives or provide a prescription. Like, it is very much a very clinical and raw diagnosis of how the world has presented itself to him, the challenges that he's had to navigate to try to find happiness and meaning in a world that he very clearly sees was designed to, in some ways, destroy him, or if it wasn't designed that way, has functioned in that way. And in that way, guess maybe this gets back to the audience, because it is a letter to his son, and it's his description to his son of, here's how I've found my way in this incredibly difficult world in which work twice as hard to go half as far, and you're going to have to deal with some of these realities. But it's in a format, it's for us to kind of look at and to see that this is how America functions for this citizen, and kind of how do we feel about that, and how can you sort of sleep knowing that that's how it works? And I guess that's one of the things that I appreciate about how unflinching it is that it's not, there's no sugar and no syrupy coating. It is raw.
Yeah, he talks about, when he's a kid, that he realizes that the world is kind of broken into these galaxies, and he, watches TV and he talks about the Mr. Belvedere life, and, the only bad things that happen to these kids is that their train set broke. And, I'm like, ooh, that's the way I grew up. It is. And when you're a kid, if you're not exposed to it, I didn't know about Ta-Nehisi Coates' childhood until I was a little bit older. And so, yeah, I guess we're all living in our separate pockets, and the walls are being torn down right now. Everybody's kind of being forced to see how other people live. Did anybody want to, just on the last question, we've kind of been talking about it throughout, but does anybody want to share, was there anything that stuck out to you that we didn't have on the list, or anything that kind of you've been thinking about a lot that stuck in your mind or changed your perspective or given you new empathy? Before you can think about that, Mike Sievers has a question. We can unmute him.
Hello again. I'm not too far into the book, but I got to a few sections where he talks about those who believe they are white. And I was wondering what you guys thought about that, what he's doing there, if it has to do with the word white as an abstract concept that is sort of equated with cleanliness and purity and light, as opposed to black, which is associated with darkness and dirt, or uncleanliness, I guess. Is that how did you guys, where do you think he's going with that?
When I read it, I thought that he was reflecting on the fact that race is a construct, and saying, there is no race, but you walk around believing I am white, and then these people say I am black, and then I am brown, because this is just what I thought, like we've all bought into this concept as if it's true. And so that's just kind of how you present to the world and identify, even though it's a made up idea. I also kind of thought that he was equating white, because at one point he referred to white people as being black. I think he was kind of referring like that white kind of meant you're safe, and you can walk through the world feeling safety, and if you're black you can't, and that sometimes white people fall into the category that he was describing as black, based on socioeconomics. That's what I thought.
Yeah, that makes sense about the construct of race. Those who believe they are white, as if it's not a real distinction at all.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
And I think there might even be one passage where he talks about, before they were white, they were Irish, and they were Italian, and they were Eastern European, that at all sorts of different points we've divided into tribes and divided, whether it was the French and the English, like that there were significant and pronounced differences between populations of what we now see as white people. And there's even one point when he talks about being at Howard and seeing some of the cartoon depictions of the Irish, which are very like simian and like pronounced, kind of the animal looking depictions of the Irish when the Irish were coming over. But that was a phase that they moved out of. Like, they weren't trapped in that portrayal. They became white. where at one point they were defined as being something other than white. They were Irish. And so I thought it was that he looks at that it is a social construct, but it's also a social construct where we allow more flexibility in some characteristics, or there's been more flexibility and fluidity in other groups of people when they're white or identified as white than there have been in other types of groups.
And Laura wrote in the comments on page 7, the last sentence is deceitfully to believe they are white. She said it was a powerful sentence, and it's true. It is powerful. Yeah, it's interesting to reading those kinds of things in this book and the last book. Even though I learned it in the last book, just to keep being reminded, I think it's a really good reminder that we're the same race. It doesn't have to mean that you have to do this like I'm colorblind thing, but just like if we're all the same race. Like you don't look at cats that are different colors and think that each one is different. It's like, you have 3 different colored cats. They're all just house cats.
Oh, they don't designate race in France and Germany. I don't think I realized that.
Oh, that's interesting.
All Germans are French.
So like there wouldn't be like African German or whatever.
Yeah. He is editing this month's Vanity Fair. Coates is, and there's a number of other writers that I've followed that are involved in it, which I didn't realize. So he's at the helm of Vanity Fair, the upcoming issue. I'm not sure if it's on newsstands yet.
Anita.
Yeah, Breonna Taylor is on the cover.
Can we unmute Anita, please?
Sorry, I'm just feeling particularly chatty tonight.
I like
it. One of the things he said, and it was just one line, but he was talking about living in that kind of fear in Baltimore, where a third of his brain was always involved with who's going to kill me next, or what tripwire am I going to walk on that's going to blow up my life. And by doing that, he was being robbed of being concerned with more beautiful things. And that really struck me, like you only have so much brain power, and if a third, whatever percentage is used up to try and protect yourself, you can't take in the rest of the world and the things that are worth seeing. So that was really powerful to me, how that could stunt someone so much.
Yeah. Yeah, you're always in a protective mode.
That hit me very much like Ijioma's chapters in talking about being a kid and not getting that moment, or what it felt like when their friends didn't correct the kids that were chanting the epithet at them from the bus. And you get these moments where you realize sort of that what I consider to be a universal experience, sort of the innocence of childhood, is anything but universal. And there's kind of that, it's just such a sinking feeling in your stomach, where that's, man, imagine having, it's hard enough to figure out who you are when you are so protected and have such a really sort of that you're safe, and to not even have that feeling of safety, or to have parents, like he talks about his home being a loving place but very hard. Yeah,
I was struck by that too, that when he was talking about his father beating him, it was more with anxiety than anger, that he was trying to keep him safe, like give him boundaries and teach him how to keep himself safe and not to do that thing that he just did that he got punished for. And it wasn't about anger, it was about trying to keep him safe and anxiety. Yeah. It was really powerful too.
Yeah, because he's not mad at his father. Like, it's not, he certainly doesn't feel, you can tell that he has some misgivings about the physical punishment, and that feels that there was a different way, but he also kind of feels that his father did the best he could. And it came from a place of, and he talks about that love merging with fear. You love someone so much that you're afraid of them, and you're doing the only thing you can to think to help them stay safe.
Yeah, he's kind of said that either I can beat him or the police can. So it's like, I'm going to teach you the best I can, or you're going downhill. So I got to save you.
Yeah. America believes itself, this is from Lori, America believes itself exceptional, the greatest and noblest nation ever to exist, a lone champion, standing between the white city of democracy and the terrorists, despots, barbarians, and other enemies of civilization. It's his description of, and that part is true, kind of that sort of the myth that we have, and sort of an ideal that I would think that I do believe in, and we believe that about our country, and we know it doesn't live up to that, and it kind of makes it more, I don't know, saying it's like this everywhere. This is just the way things happen, and if it's not one group, it's another. It shouldn't. We do think we're better. Like, we do think we've come up with a better government. We should hold ourselves to and be judged by a different standard.
That's what's been interesting about COVID and quarantine, and now being, really bad at trying to contain it. I mean, you grow up here with people constantly saying, we're the best, we do everything better. We're like a conceited, bully on the playground. And now it's like, oh shit, we're not, I grew up with a foreign dad. And so I felt like I never felt that about America because, my dad and we traveled, and you go and you see other places and you're like, oh, there's other places the same as us or better. Like, we're not the best. But people who haven't had that experience feel that way. But I mean, it's interesting growing up though in a country that's always been very stable, and where you're not worrying about being bombed and things like that. When this is happening, it makes you start to wonder, like when you're a kid and you read history books and you see different countries rise and fall over long periods of time. Like, we haven't been in a fall yet. Like, maybe that's about to happen. Maybe we're not going to be on top anymore because of our economy. And it'll just be interesting to see what happens to our country in our lifetime. I mean, I hope that it doesn't get worse, but just with the way the economy is right now, it's kind of not hard to see us slip. And hopefully our ego doesn't get in the way of us helping ourselves.
Yeah. Or our refusal to recognize reality.
Yeah.
By claiming that it's all invented.
Yeah, exactly. Like, just keep blaming people and pretend it's going to go away that way. Yeah.
Too late.
Oh, Jane wrote, I keep thinking your body, your skin, you can't leave it until you are dead. Black people in America wear it every day. There isn't a break of walking out, especially here in Seattle, as Black versus white always feeling noticed.
Yeah. It's kind of what we were just talking about with what he was describing as a child, all of the different weight that he has to shoulder that other people don't, that I think people of color are constantly conscious of those realities. And we choose to engage with the subject, and that's not a choice for people of color.
Mike Sievers has a comment.
Oh yeah, just real quick. I really like the thing about exceptionalism that someone brought up, and it reminded me of something he said earlier in the book, and this is paraphrased, but he said, I propose we take our claims of American exceptionalism seriously. Like, okay, if we're that great, let's embrace that. And he says, apply an exceptional moral standard. But then he says, ironically, there exists all around us an apparatus encouraging us to accept things as they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that strikes me as something that, relates to our current administration, where you have sort of the constant cheerleading, but simultaneously the impression that any questioning that is not allowed. Or, if you do question it, you're fake news, or you're kicked out of the room.
Yeah. I think I think it also ties to the discussion of reparations, because that's what I thought of when that line that you're talking about, Mike, where he says like, let's take it seriously, and it is like if we're going to hold ourselves to that standard that's laid out in the founding documents, like there's something owed to the people whose families built the economy, but were deprived of any ability to hold property or to enjoy the fruit of that labor. And in fact, were victimized by it. That if we're going to take that, and when the discussion of reparations comes up, inevitably the pushback is that, well, that happened hundreds of years ago. We're beyond that. And clearly the legacy and the impacts down the road. There was a story that I read, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, about Manhattan Beach in California, Los Angeles. There was a black family and a group of people that had property there, and it was just taken from them. And now, like, the actual value of that property, where they were just booted off of it, and those sort of things. And we tend to say like, oh, that happened a long time ago. They say we, like that, the people who argue against it.
Yeah, I hadn't heard much about reparations until more recently, and it seems like a pretty reasonable thing to expect, really. Because like you said, it's not a couple hundred years ago, it's all up through the 60s and 70s and 80s, 90s, and today.
Coates had written, I'll look it up and I'll email it to our group. Coates has written about reparations in the Atlantic. It was a very powerful essay that he put together. I'm not sure, I think it was before this book was written, but I'm not sure of that.
Do you think that politicians and people who can actually make change know, like before this recent social justice movement started and people started becoming way more aware because you couldn't help it, everything's in the news. Do you think that people who can make change knew about all of these things and just didn't care, or didn't know about all of them? I mean, I'm just wondering, you know, why there hasn't been change. Is it just easier to continue on with the way things are than to try to make big changes? I mean, why do you think things are the way they are? I mean, not all lawmakers, you know, not all white lawmakers are bad, but it didn't seem like anybody was doing anything. I'm just curious, why? Is it just laziness until people have to like rally in the streets and they have no other choice?
It's a great question. Certainly most of the change that has happened, going to civil rights, going back to the push for the vote, has happened through appeals for legislation, and in some ways judicial or federal help. That has generally been because left to its own, the American political system has not tended to recognize the grievances of disenfranchised people at local and state levels. I don't know what is the root of that. Is it because of all of the moneyed interests have an incentive in keeping the system the same? Like that part's definitely true, but there are people that are crusaders and do make moral causes. I certainly think that asking a group that is in power and enjoys the benefits of the system to change the system is difficult. Like, I think throughout history, people are loath or reticent to give up power.
Well, we're at 8 o'clock. It's our hour. Thanks again for everyone who came. We have found, unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to preserve the group chat. So if you didn't get a chance to read it while we were on here and you want to, make sure you read that before you log off, because that will go away. But this conversation will be recorded and you could do whatever you want with that. But yeah, I remember last time people were disappointed because there was like references to books and podcasts and stuff. And then the chat is just totally gone. So, oh, Kathy knows how to save the chat.
No kidding.
Kathy, how do you know
Oh,
that?
whiz.
Kathy, who
Seriously.
told you? Oh, Steven said he thinks he saved it. Okay, so maybe it's saved, but you know, just in case, read it before you log off. And then, yeah, like normal, I'll send an email out with the next date, probably like 2 weeks from today on Tuesday. And I don't know exactly like where we cut off or what, but we'll just assume we went halfway, whatever, like page 150 or something. Or no, the whole thing's 150. So, you know, we'll do the last 75 pages. And yeah, oh, click on the file. So yeah, she's saying in the comments how to save the comments. Anyway, thank you guys so much. We'll see you in a couple weeks. We really appreciate you coming.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Made my Tuesday.